Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Tip of the Iceberg Live, your home for Pittsburgh Penguins news and analysis. You can find us on YouTube at Tip of the Iceberg or anywhere you get your podcasts from. I'm hoping everybody's enjoying first couple of days of July, some of the craziness from the National Hockey League since free agency opened on July 1st. We'll get into some of those moves that were made by the Pittsburgh Penguins, the direction of the organization as stated by Kyle Dubas in his press conference on Monday afternoon, and a couple of moves that happened yesterday afternoon that finished shaping up the defense core for the Pittsburgh Penguins. And of course, we'll close things out by answering all of your questions in the comments section if you're tuned in live at Tip of the Iceberg on YouTube. Thank you to everybody that is tuned in live. As we'll get into, let's start with the defense, because when you look at the moves that were made yesterday, one was clearly a reaction to the other. And let's start with the Pittsburgh Penguins brought into the organization, which is left-handed defenseman Sebastian Aho. And no, not the Sebastian Aho that is down in Carolina. The Sebastian Aho that you know from the New York Islanders, the Swedish one, signs a 2-year contract with the Pittsburgh Penguins at $775,000 annually. Like I said, left-handed defenseman. I tweeted out yesterday that as soon as he signed, he's going to be able to battle for the seventh defenseman role. And then I saw him get that second year. And all of a sudden, to me, that signals that he is the leader in the clubhouse for the seventh defenseman slot behind a pretty interesting left side, as we'll get to here in a little bit, with Marcus Pettersson, Ryan Graves, and newcomer Matt Grzelcyk. But you bring in Sebastian Aho, a guy who on his career, 190 games played, 50 points, -10 career rating. He is exactly what the Penguins are bringing him in to be. At 28 years old, he's a guy that you know what he's going to be. You bring him in as a seventh defenseman, he's an injury replacement, or if the bottom falls out on a guy like Matt Grzelcyk and he continues to go in a way that he is going right now, then you have a backup option in Sebastian Aho. You have somebody else outside of Ryan Shea to be able to battle for that opportunity to be one of your top three on the left side. I mean, the Pittsburgh Penguins defense left a lot to be desired last year. So getting more options is never a bad thing. Bringing in a guy like Sebastian Aho, who his time was up in New York. I saw a couple of reports that were saying that he kind of fell out of favor with Lane Lambert before he got fired up there. And then he got an opportunity under Patrick Roy when he became the head coach of the New York Islanders last year. And he kind of just wasn't able to beat out the players that were in front of him. I mean, that was the direct quote by Patrick Roy late in the season when asked about Sebastian Aho getting a couple of healthy scratches. It was, it's nothing that he was doing personally. It's nothing that he was doing at all. He just wasn't beating out the players in front of him. He'll get an opportunity to try to beat out guys like Matt Grzelcyk and Ryan Graves, who are coming off of some pretty bad seasons. But those players, on the other hand, do have a much higher ceiling than a guy in Sebastian Aho. Now, whose spot does he end up taking? That is one of P.O. Joseph. Obviously, Joseph brought into the Pittsburgh Penguins organization as part of the return for Phil Kessel back in either 2019 or 2020. It's been so long, I almost can't remember. But P.O. Joseph's time with the Pittsburgh Penguins does come to an end. The Penguins decided on Sunday they weren't going to qualify the restricted free agent, allows him to walk to free agency, and he decides that he wants to join his brother Matthew by signing with the St. Louis Blues on a 1-year deal, $950,000 for the former now, I should say, Penguins defenseman. In his career, 147 games played, 37 points, and a +4 total rating. It's an interesting swap here because personally, the signing of Grzelcyk to me automatically made P.O. Joseph a seventh defenseman. Joseph saw himself differently, saw an opportunity to play with his brother, and he took it down in St. Louis. I think part of that is going to be the fact that, again, we'll never know this for sure, but it seems as if the Penguins were notified that P.O. Joseph wasn't going to take the contract that they offered him, that he was going to look elsewhere, and they went out and they got somebody to replace him right away, and that was Sebastian Aho. So I'm interested to see what Aho looks like, but to me, he is a seventh defenseman. We'll bring up the rundown and we'll bring up the projected lineup here in a couple of minutes, and I'll show you exactly where I see him in favor of the rest of the defense. But when you look at bringing in a guy like that, again, similar to a lot of moves that Kyle Dubas has done this offseason, low risk move, potentially decent reward, not absorbently high reward. The ceiling is not through the roof, but at the same time, you bring in somebody that's going to be able to help your team out and going to be able to, especially on that left side, kind of balance the scales when you look at the AHL level, allowing a guy like Ryan Shea to continue to play if he's not going to be in the NHL lineup, give him some seasoning at the AHL level. Or, if the tables turn, you get some injuries, a guy in Sebastian Aho who has played a lot of hockey at the National Hockey League level. He has played at the AHL level, but that hasn't been for a couple seasons. So you're bringing in a guy that has spent a lot of time as an in the lineup, out of the lineup type of guy in Sebastian Aho, especially last season. Let's move over and talk about the main reason that I have this live stream today and the main topic of conversation for this live stream today. And that is, where does this new direction for the Pittsburgh Penguins leave the 2024-25 edition? Because as we've seen over the last week, both with Kyle Dubas's moves when it comes to trades and free agent signings, as well as his words on Monday, the rebuild is here. We've always speculated, when are they going to rebuild? And a lot of people, including me, said, well, as long as Crosby is playing at this level, 90 plus points a season, it makes it pretty hard to rebuild. Kyle Dubas said, not so fast. I can rebuild right now. And that's what it appears to be that they're doing. This is the quote from Kyle Dubas on Monday afternoon at his news conference. Question credit goes to Rob Rossi of The Athletic, asking about the on-ice direction of the Pittsburgh Penguins. And part of Dubas's response was very telling to me. Quote, "We're not looking to simply squeak into the playoffs. It's to return the team to becoming a contender as soon as possible. Can we do that this season? Can we do that next season? It's hard to put a time frame on it." That is in every way except actually explicitly stating it, saying that the Pittsburgh Penguins have officially entered a rebuilding process. Now, you could try to change up the way it sounds, rebuild, retool, shotgun rebuild we heard a couple times early in the offseason. The fact of the matter is, it's a rebuild, because no, they can't immediately become a contender next season with anything that he does to materially change the team on paper going into this season. The only way they become a contender is if a lot of the players on their team, and we'll get to this, overplay what they're expected to play, overperform what their expectations are going into this season. So the Pens are in a rebuild. And that brings up the question that I wanted to ask and wanted to get everybody else's opinion on here in the comments section. Where does that leave the Penguins of this year? Because he's looking to the future, is Kyle Dubas. He wants picks. He wants prospects. He's only signing contracts for 1 year or 2 years simply because, well, in 2 years, Evgeny Malkin retires, and then you can really start to tank this team into a rebuild. But where does that leave this team? Because Dubas also mentioned as part of that answer that the team that's in the room right now is too good to completely throw everything out the window, completely bury it down to the studs and rebuild from there. So what does that make this year's team? It's a rebuilding team from an organizational standpoint, but the team on the ice in 2024-25, on paper, I'll say it right now, to me, it looks better than the team on paper looked last year, at least slightly better, not significant by any stance of the word. But when you look at the team on paper, I will say, for the most part, it looks like it could potentially be right up there with last year's team. Let's bring up the roster right now. This is what we're looking at, projected roster, projected lineup for the Pittsburgh Penguins to begin the 2024-25 season. And little caveat to this is the fact that there 100% will be another move or multiple moves made in this offseason by Kyle Dubas. So this is by no means the set in stone lineup for opening night, October, I believe it's 9th against the New York Rangers. But this is where we stand as of right now. The top six remains unchanged. Drew O'Connor, Sidney Crosby, Brian Rust. As far as first lines go, you can take it or leave it, right? What did I say at the start of this offseason for those of you that have been following along the whole time? Drew O'Connor was fine in that first line role last year. But what he would be better at is if you're able to get somebody up there, which reports are saying that the Penguins are looking to get somebody to put up there next to Crosby, and allow Drew O'Connor to bump down to where Anthony Beauvillier is as the third line left wing. But as it stands right now, O'Connor, Crosby, and Brian Rust. Second line, again, remains the same as it was in the last game last season. Michael Bunting, Evgeny Malkin, and Rickard Rakell. Raquel's in for a bounce back season. Kyle Dubas mentioned it on Monday, said he's too good to not bounce back, and that's what they're hoping happens. So I expect Rickard Rakell to bounce back. Not only that, we saw Rickard Rakell play some of his best hockey of last season with Michael Bunting and Evgeny Malkin. So you're hoping that that is just a recipe for success on the second line. But again, if you look back at that last game of the season against the Islanders, the top six remains unchanged. The bottom six, whole lot of turnover. Third line, Anthony Beauvillier, Kevin Hayes, Valtteri Puustinen being the only holdover from late last season. Kevin Hayes obviously brought in over the weekend, including a second-round pick coming over from the St. Louis Blues for future considerations. Anthony Beauvillier signing a one-year contract out of free agency on the opening day on Monday. I look at this third line. I think there's a lot more offensive potential here. Kevin Hayes, of course, a half-decent two-way center, but at the same time, you're losing a lot of speed. You're losing a lot of, you have size there, but you're not getting any younger having Kevin Hayes being your third line center. You bring in Beauvillier. He was one of the younger free agents on the open market at 27 years old. As far as third lines go, this is not a third line of a contender, as we all know. This is not a third line of even a top two team in the Metropolitan Division. Considering what the Washington Capitals did, it might not even be a third line that would be top four in the Metropolitan Division. But I think when you look at this third line, if they play at their highest level, which again, we'll get back to in a little bit here, it is an improvement on last year. At least offensively, it is going to be an improvement on last year. And if you can get somebody in that Drew O'Connor role on the first line, on the left wing, and you get Drew O'Connor, Kevin Hayes, Valtteri Puustinen, then I think you have materially and significantly improved what the third line looks like. And then you go to the fourth line. Blake Lizotte. Everybody loved the addition of Blake Lizotte. He's one of two players, including Sebastian Aho, who we talked about earlier, to get a 2-year deal this week from Kyle Dubas. Blake Lizotte slots in as a fourth line left wing. He can play center as well. I think something might have to give when it comes to center because you have Crosby, Malkin, Kevin Hayes can play center, Lars Eller can play center, Noel Acciari can play center, Blake Lizotte can play center, Anthony Beauvillier. You get my drift here. There might be something that has to give, especially if Kyle Dubas is looking to continue to gain salary cap space, continue to gain draft picks, and continue to gain a more bright future in the Penguins prospect rankings. That might be one of Eller or Acciari. I talked about that yesterday, but that's where it stands right now. Lizotte, Eller, Acciari as your fourth line. You get to bump Eller down from 3C to 4C. I think that's an improvement, and you get to bump Noel Acciari from center to wing, which I also think that is a massive improvement. So at the end of the day, top six remains the same. Bottom six, slightly better as we stand right now. The defense, on the other hand, not too much difference. First pairing the same, Marcus Pettersson and Erik Karlsson. I think that's going to be your top pairing regardless. Matt Grzelcyk comes in, slots in as a number 2 defenseman on the left side. He will likely start the year with Chris Letang. He spent majority of his career so far playing alongside Charlie McAvoy at the top of the Boston Bruins defense corps. Last season wasn't his year. He ended up being a healthy scratch. If you look at the season before, you started to see some of the seeds of doubt being planted in Matt Grzelcyk's time with Boston. Success was also evading him that year. That all dates back to the coaching change between Bruce Cassidy and Jim Montgomery. Maybe with a new system, maybe with a new coach, Matt Grzelcyk refines his form. And if he does that, you're in pretty good position with him and Chris Letang. What that also does is it bumps Ryan Graves down, puts him in a much better position to succeed. Him and Jack St. Ivany is your third pairing. And then in net, you have Tristan Jarry and a returning Alex Nedeljkovic. So again, on paper, not a materially worse team than last year. And last year, they finished 3 points shy of making the playoffs. So while they are, yes, 100% expecting to go into a rebuild, I will say this. The team that they have on paper as of right now, it's not going to be the worst in the league. It's not going to bottom out, and some people might want it to bottom out, but I think that's where the respect for this core comes, where they say, we're going to give you pieces that at the end of the day, these pieces, if they perform up to snuff, could make you a playoff team. And if the Stars are able to pull them into the playoffs, then that's what they're going to be happy about. They're going to say, all right, you're a playoff team while we're rebuilding. We're not giving up assets to try to, bring in big pieces. They're not going to spend copious amounts of money in free agency like we saw other teams spend, like the Vancouver Canucks, like the Nashville Predators, who believe they're right on the cusp. The Penguins are on the downturn, and they're trying to turn the ship around to get right back on the upswing. It's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to do. But we started this entire segment by saying, what direction does this team have? On paper, they look very similar to last year's team, which would put them somewhere around a bubble playoff team. I think their fate in 2024-25 is going to be determined by two factors. One of them more important than the other. First factor, and the most important, and the obvious one here, can the Penguins' top players remain healthy again? And can they maintain the level of success that they have been showing at an advanced age? Crosby and Malkin, back-to-back 82-game seasons. Crosby back-to-back over 90-point seasons at 35 and 36 years old. Evgeny Malkin, some will say he had a down year, still ranked among the top 10 in second-line centers in scoring. Can they maintain those levels? Can they maintain that level of health? Chris Letang, coming off of an 82-game season, but he had multiple injuries. One being a finger injury. The other ones we have yet to be told. So can Letang stay healthy? Can he remain healthy throughout a season where he's not dealing with stuff but still playing, which we saw last year led to a regression of his play as time went on? Can he stay healthy throughout the season? And then Erik Karlsson played 82 games last year, but can he elevate his level? A lot of people said he had a disappointing season in his first with the Pittsburgh Penguins. I personally, when I'm projecting next season, I'm projecting Erik Karlsson to have a better year. We'll obviously have exact numbers as we get closer to the year and as we start to see how everything else shapes up whenever training camp begins, but I would project Erik Karlsson to have a better year talent-wise. Can he match that with another year of health? So that is factor number one to whether or not this team will be a playoff team in 2024-25. Number two, and the one that, outside of keeping your stars healthy, the one that is going to be, you can say goaltending, you can say the power play. How many of these reclamation projects work? You saw the lineup. I just put it out there on YouTube at Inside the Penguins. You looked at the lineup. And the one thing I didn't mention is he had Sebastian Aho, Jesse Puljujärvi, who's still technically a reclamation project. You had John Ludwig, who's trying to get his feet wet at the NHL level after a first year marred by injuries. Emil Bemstrom, who's trying to find his stride in his second organization at the NHL. There's a lot of reclamation projects on the Penguins roster. And that's what they're going to look at whenever they're a rebuilding team. Guys like Anthony Beauvillier, who has been a suitcase for the last 2 seasons, 4 teams in 2 years. A guy like Rickard Rakell, who signed a massive deal after a really solid first couple of years after being traded. The Penguins signed a massive deal, had a disappointing season last year. Kevin Hayes had a disappointing season last year. Look on the defense side. Ryan Graves, Matt Grzelcyk, both of them in the last 3 seasons, there were a time where they were looked at as a top 4 defenseman on any given team in the National Hockey League. Last year, Ryan Graves was the top defenseman, especially defensive defenseman, available on the open market. Matt Grzelcyk, there weren't very many left-handed defensemen, but he was among the best. I know that's not saying much because there wasn't many available, but he's a guy who at his best made up a really good defense pairing with Charlie McAvoy. Can one or both of those guys reclaim what they used to be at the National Hockey League level? That's going to be factor number 2. How many of these reclamation projects actually work and how many of them continue to go the way in which they've been going lately for their NHL careers? Because say 3 of those 5 that I just mentioned, Beauvillier, Rakell, Hayes, Graves, and Grzelcyk, if 3 of the 5 of them continue to struggle and continue to go on the path that they showed last year, Penguins are going to be right back in the same situation where it's going to be the top stars dragging the carcass of a remainder of an NHL roster as far as they can. And we saw the last couple of years, right now, at the age they're at, the farthest they can drag them alone is 3 points or 1 point shy of a playoff spot. So I'm not saying playoffs is off the table, even for a team that is now outwardly rebuilding, but I am saying they're going to need 2 big factors to go in their favor, and that is the health and level of their star players, and that is these reclamation projects. Can David Quinn go in there and help Graves and Grzelcyk and revitalize Erik Karlsson to the level he was at his Norris Trophy season, get him back up towards the 70-point mark, the 80-point mark? Can that happen? Can the power play be figured out by David Quinn? Can that be reclaimed? Those are going to be the biggest question marks for the Pittsburgh Penguins for this season. We understand that the moves from the front office are all going to be pointed towards the future. Prospects, picks, and some of these players, even if they come in and they look really good this season, Anthony Beauvillier, Kevin Hayes, Matt Grzelcyk. There's a chance that they end up getting flipped at the trade deadline if the Penguins are not in a very solid playoff position by the time that rolls around in 2025. So it should be an interesting year. Like I mentioned, there is still plenty that needs to take place during the 2024 offseason. The Penguins, they're still looking for somebody to play with Sidney Crosby. Who knows if the door is shut on making any more changes to the goaltending room? Who knows if that door ever shuts, right? If Joel Blomqvist becomes a no-doubt guy that needs to get NHL time, at what point does Tristan Jarry begin getting shopped during the regular season? Should be an interesting next couple of months for the Penguins organization leading into a season that is going to be very intriguing, right? Because you got a rebuilding team at the organizational level, but you got a team and specifically a core of players that are as, I don't know what word I'm looking for here, that they're as competitive as any core has ever been at the National Hockey League. I'm talking about Crosby, Malkin, and a guy like Chris Letang, who is uber competitive as well. They're not just going to sit there and let the Penguins tank. It's not going to happen like that. So interesting season on the horizon for the Pittsburgh Penguins. But keep asking your questions in the comment section. I'm going to take a quick break. When I come back, we'll try to answer as many, and if I can, all of them. Thank you guys so much for tuning in right now. I'll be back in just about a minute. Welcome back to the Tip of the Ice-Burgh Live. You can find us on YouTube at Tip of the Ice-Burgh or anywhere you get your podcast from. Let's get into your questions. Got a lot of good ones in here. Obviously, the opening of free agency has everybody juiced up about the NHL. We see Jake Gensel signing with the Tampa Bay Lightning and Steven Stamkos effectively being the back source of that, going out the other way to the Nashville Predators. It's been interesting, but we'll get into all of your questions that we can here. Let's start with Wolf of YouTube. Do you think we end up getting Vladimir Tarasenko? Yes, of course. Josh Yohe of The Athletic putting out yesterday that the Penguins did extend an offer out to two-time Stanley Cup champion winger Vladimir Tarasenko. I think he would be exactly what the doctor ordered for the Penguins' top six. I don't know if they end up getting him, though, for one of a couple reasons. One, the Penguins can't offer, an opportunity at Stanley Cup number 3 this year. They just can't. They're not going to offer more than 2 years. Kyle Dubas has already, expressly stated that unless a young player that can help them far into the future comes out of the woodwork, they're not going to give out a long-term contract or a big money contract. And 3, that's just the other thing. If it gets to be a bidding war for Vladimir Tarasenko, who as of right now is probably the best or top 3 free agents remaining, if there's a bidding war for his services, Penguins can't afford it. I understand that they can still make a trade here. They can make a trade there and clear up some salary cap space, but they're not going to be able to afford it if it gets up to $4.5 million for Vladimir Tarasenko. For them, it has to stay down around $3.5 million, maybe even $3 million if he wants to come play with his fellow countrymen in Evgeny Malkin. So do I think they end up getting him? It would be nice. It's nice that they're going after him. I think that's a great addition. If they can do it, I would say the odds are that he ends up going somewhere else, because I just don't think the Penguins have enough to offer a guy like Vladimir Tarasenko, unless he specifically just wants to go to a team and play with his countrymen and play with Sidney Crosby and just make his money and have fun playing the game. If that's what he wants, which I don't know, because I don't know Vladimir Tarasenko personally, then great. Penguins have a shot, but I just think other teams have more to offer him. And if they do, the Penguins just aren't going to be able to keep up with that. Let's go to the next question here. Gunnar Murphy wants to know, who are you most excited to see at roster development camp? And if you're not in the know, July 6th through the 10th in Cranberry at UPMC Lemieux Sports Complex, 48 young players will be taking part in roster development camp for the Pittsburgh Penguins. When I looked at the list today, because the roster came out today at pittsburghpenguins.com, there are your usual suspects that you expected to be there. Owen Pickering, Braden Yeager, who has been electrifying ever since he stepped foot in the Penguins organization last year at the NHL draft. I'm excited to see all 6 of the draft picks from this past weekend are going to be in attendance. I'm excited to get that first look at them, hear what they have to say joining the Penguins organization. But one player stood out to me right away over my cursory search of that roster. Ville Koivunen. Him and Cruz Lucius, who were both part of the Jake Gensel trade back in March, are going to be at rookie development camp. And Koivunen is the most interesting one to me. He tore up Europe last year in the professional leagues. He's coming over to North America, or at least is expected to come over to North America this year. You would assume that he starts the year in Wilkes-Barre, but this is a guy that has all the talent in the world. If he can impress from this weekend on, he might be in a position where he's going to push one of those veterans that we had on the roster out. Maybe Anthony Beauvillier becomes a moot point. Maybe he becomes a waiver, guy, and he turns into being just an asset the Penguins don't need, similar to a guy last year like Andreas Janssen, what he ended up being, Evgeny Hinostroza by the midway point of the season. I'm really intrigued to see what Ville Koivunen ends up looking like in his first appearance outside of the Calder Cup playoffs, the short 2-game Calder Cup playoffs. I'm excited to see what Ville Koivunen looks like with the Penguins this weekend. Team Crusade says, what if Dubas traded Raquel to replace him with a guy like Vladimir Tarasenko, and the one left wing could be Jack Roslovic? I like Jack Roslovic as an option. I think he would be more a third-line center, third-line winger type guy, if all things were considered as best possible scenario. But again, I don't think Kyle Dubas is going to trade Rickard Rakell. Personally, I feel like everything that we saw last year, I feel like what we know about Rickard Rakell and what he was the year prior, it just feels like he's going to be one of those players that end up being on the list that Kyle Dubas wants to see step up and have a much better bounce back season in 2024-25. So I don't think Rakell's on the trade train, especially because I'm also not sure what the market is for a guy that has 4 years left on his contract, that has a modified no trade clause, and that is coming off of one of the worst seasons he's had in the last 4 or 5 seasons. So it'd be interesting if he does pull it off and does obviously open up the space then to bring in guys like Tarasenko and maybe even Roslovic. I would say Tarasenko goes one left wing, and you have Roslovic as a depth piece. Maybe he becomes your third line center. Kevin Hayes becomes your fourth line center, and you bump out both Eller and Achari, or maybe you try to trade Eller even more so then. Christopher, as a question here, says, from Dubas's statements, do you think in 2 years we will be a cup contender with the entire roster except the 4 that matter gone? If I had to put a bet on it, I would say no, right? The last time we saw something like this in a parallel situation, we saw it with the New York Rangers. They decided that they were going to do a little rebuild. They sent out a letter to the fans, which the Penguins are not doing. And then they lucked out a heck of a lot, right? They ended up signing Artemi Panarin. They ended up getting the first overall pick and Alexis Lafreniere. The year prior to that, they got the second overall pick in Capo Caco. Everything worked out perfectly for the New York Rangers. And that's why their rebuild was so short. But even then, it was right on the brink of that 2-year timeline. I would say this is an impossible job for Kyle Dubas to make this team a Stanley Cup contender in the next couple of years. Am I going to rule it out entirely? No, because I do think that the 4 that matter that you referenced there, Christopher, are 4 that at their best, and if they can stay at their best, can carry a team with half-decent pieces further than they should. Do I think that they'll be able to get the half-decent pieces? Do I think that that's what Dubas has assembled here in the opening days of free agency? That much remains to be seen. I want to be able to see them on the ice at least once. That's all I ask, at least once, before I start making that presumption. But if I was a betting man, I would say no. I don't think he's able to make the Penguins a cup contender in the next 2 years, especially if he's trying to do it by way of rebuilding, giving some free agency scraps to Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin and the gang, and saying, make the best of what you got here, and we'll see how far that takes you. I just don't see that being a possibility. Z Smoove has a question, says, I think we should make a move on Ryan Suter. He's old, yes, but he can be a third pairing right-handed defenseman behind Chris Letang and Erik Karlsson. And that's the problem that I personally have with this idea. Now, Z, if it wasn't for the fact that the Penguins have both Letang and Karlsson, I would say, yeah, maybe you take a bet on a Ryan Suter. But right now, your third pairing right-handed defenseman is Jack St. Ivany. And that is a guy that you want to give as much ice time to as humanly possible early next season, because they threw him into the fire last year. He didn't just float. He swam pretty well. I'm not going to say Michael Phelps fast, but I will say that he stood up for himself and he really made a name for himself at the tail end stretch of last season. So I don't think the Penguins need another defenseman on the right side unless you're getting a depth guy. I don't think Ryan Suter is that guy. And personally, unless there is a big move, i.e. Ryan Graves, unless somebody takes Ryan Graves, which again, highly doubt it. I don't think it's plausible this offseason. But unless that happens, I think the Penguins are done on defense. I think the defense that you see now is the defense you're going to see heading into the season. They're going to hope that David Quinn can come in here, work some magic, and get the best out of these players like he's done in the past with guys like Erik Karlsson. So I don't mind the name. I think when other teams are looking for a veteran to kind of round things out, maybe be a seventh defenseman on the right side, Ryan Suter's name is going to come up, especially because he's going to be cheap. He's currently on 2 other teams' salary caps because he's been bought out, obviously, by Minnesota and now by the Dallas Stars, but he's not going to be coming to the Pittsburgh Penguins. I feel like they're done on defense. Toxic Friends asks about a very interesting name that whether or not he comes to the Penguins, I'm intrigued to see what his future has for him. Toxic Friends asks, do you think Jacob Vrana would be a good fit or worth trying to go after? Jacob Vrana is a classic case of immense talent that can't get out of his own way. That's what his entire career has been. He's had some issues, and obviously that cost him time with the Detroit Red Wings. I believe that is why he was sent away from there. And then he went to the St. Louis Blues, had a decent start, and then faded into the back once again. If Vrana can put it all together, he would be a tremendous addition for the bottom 6. I just don't know if any NHL team, or which NHL team I should say, maybe not any, because sometimes talent trumps all and teams just want talent and as much as they can get, especially when they're going to sign as cheap as Jacob Vrana does. Do I think he would be a nice addition? I do. Do I think he would be a fit with the Pittsburgh Penguins specifically? I'm not quite sure. I don't know if they would go after a guy like Jacob Vrana, especially because they've already made those moves to bring in younger veterans like a guy like Anthony Beauvillier, a guy like Blake Lizotte, who's pretty young, but he still has, a lot of NHL experience under his belt. I think they've already filled their quota on that. And unless Vrana is still dangling out there at the start of training camp and could come in as a PTO, I don't think he's going to end up in the Pittsburgh Penguins organization. Arthur goes back to Vladimir Tarasenko, who's obviously the biggest name that everybody wants to talk about this week. But he says if Tarasenko doesn't work out, would a returning Daniel Sprong be a potential option as a bit of middle six or third line scoring? This guy is, Daniel Sprong, it obviously didn't work in his first stint in Pittsburgh. And a large portion of that was because of his, I don't want to say inability, but his lack of desire to play defense. And that has kind of followed him throughout his entire NHL career. When he was finding success with Seattle, when he was finding success last season with the Detroit Red Wings, that has still followed him around. And the head coach, as last I checked for the Penguins, is still Mike Sullivan. And I don't know why. It just doesn't feel like those two are going to be able to work together again at the NHL level. So I would say Sprong does not end up becoming an option for the Penguins, even if they don't go out there and land a guy like Vladimir Tarasenko. Not to mention the fact that that's not what they need right now. They don't need third line scoring. They need somebody to play with Sidney Crosby and then bump everybody else down. Team Crusade says, could Lizotte's signing, the 2-year deal that Blake Lizotte signed on the opening day of free agency, cause a Lars Eller trade? Yes, it could. Short version, yes, Team Crusade 100% could cause a Lars Eller trade. In fact, that's what I speculated about yesterday. I kind of hinted at it earlier today. There's a lot of centers there, right? Crosby, Malkin, they're 1-2. That's easy, cut and dry, go away. Kevin Hayes is your third line center. Kyle Dubas stated that that's where he's going to start. He likes him there, and I think you have him in that position. Now, Blake Lizotte plays center. If you want him as your fourth line center, where does that put Lars Eller? You could realistically move him over to the wing, but in this time where Kyle Dubas is trying to get as many draft picks, as many prospects, to open the door to the future of the organization as much as he is, you're not going to just carry Lars Eller to carry Lars Eller. So I think it puts Lars Eller on a potential trade block. I think it puts Noel Acciari on a potential trade block. I don't think it'll be both, because I think the Pittsburgh Penguins will want to have at least one of them on the roster. I think it would likely be Eller if one of the two are traded, simply because Lars Eller probably brings back a little bit more by way of, assets on the return. Justin asks, could you see Philip Zadina signing and playing with Sid? I don't think they would sign him to play with Sidney Crosby. And that's the thing. When I'm looking at these options, I think the only name in free agency right now that makes sense as a signing for that position is Vladimir Tarasenko. If it's not going to be Tarasenko on the open market, I think they look at a trade, and that's something I'm trying to look through and see who could potentially be available, who could fit that mold as a trade prospect for the Pittsburgh Penguins to play alongside Sidney Crosby, where it's not going to cost them an arm and a leg, and where it's going to bring somebody in that can play with Crosby on a short-term deal. So I still need to look into that, but I don't think they're going to get that person unless it's Vladimir Tarasenko. I don't think they're going to end up getting that person on the open market. So I don't see Philip Zadina being a guy that comes to the Pittsburgh Penguins. American Coasters says, where would Vlad go if they sign him? And that is exactly where we've been talking about. First line, he's a right winger. Makes it a little bit more complicated. So what I would say, and I think I said this yesterday, if you're going to go with Vladimir Tarasenko, see, I'm getting all messed up now because the Pirates and Vladimir Guerrero is something I've been thinking about a lot lately too. But hockey here. Vladimir Tarasenko comes into the Penguins. He's a right winger. I think at that point, what I could see is Rickard Rakell moving to the left, bumping up with Crosby, who he has succeeded with time and time again with this organization. You have Rakell, Crosby, Rust. Then you have Michael Bunting and Evgeny Malkin, who have worked very well together. And for the first time, seemingly in his entire career, Evgeny Malkin has a Russian winger that is a very talented goal scorer. And I think that's where he ends up going if he joins the Pittsburgh Penguins. Team Crusade says, who could be a Tristan Jarry replacement if the Penguins end up moving on from the netminder? It's interesting because the trade market has slowed significantly on goaltenders, specifically because it was so rapid early on in the offseason. By early on in the offseason, it's only been 2 weeks long, but 2 weeks ago, you saw Jacob Markstrom move. You saw Darcy Kemper move. You saw a couple of signings in free agency. You saw Ilya Samsonov go to, I believe, the Vegas Golden Knights. So now they have Aiden Hill and Ilya Samsonov. I kind of like that duo. There's not a lot by way of the trade market right now that's available. So I think that if they move on from Tristan Jarry, there's only a handful of options out there that they could go for. I know a lot of people have mentioned John Gibson. That is not an answer that I want to hear, especially with the contract that he has. Honestly, best case scenario at this point in time, considering who is available, who's not available, you might have to wait for the market to heat up a little bit more. Maybe you get into the season, Tristan Jarry does what he does, and he gets off to a hot start. And before he hits that climax and that downturn on January 1st, maybe by then Joel Blomqvist is ready to go. Alex Nedeljkovic has proven that he can be the guy that he was at the end of the season, but still be a little bit better. Over a 900 save percentage would be nice. And then maybe you just trade Tristan Jarry, go with those two, and then see what the goaltending market looks like next offseason. It's going to be interesting because, again, everything we've heard, reporting by Rob Rossi of The Athletic, Josh Yohe of The Athletic, Penguins were not happy with how Tristan Jarry finished last season. If they run it back with him this year, last year the excuse when they signed that contract was it was the best option available. This year, there were some other options available, but understandably, they're trying to maintain as many picks and as many prospects as they can because they're heading into a rebuild. So it's going to be very difficult. Yankees Dynasty says, no, it's only July 3rd and free agency started on the 1st, but how would you rate the team's offseason thus far, moves and etc.? You can look at it from two ways. When the offseason started, I looked at this as the way that Kyle Dubas had been stating. They're going to continue to try to give Sidney Crosby the best chance possible to go for Stanley Cup number 4. That messaging has changed, right? So if I was looking at from the beginning of the offseason, if you told me these were the moves that happened, I'd probably give it a C- or a D+, because I'd say this is not making this team. Really, you can argue, and I did argue that it makes it better, but it doesn't make it substantially better. And last year they weren't a playoff team. So how does making it, barely better make them a contender next year? It doesn't. So C-, D+ if I'm looking at it from that aspect. But since then, as we talked about in this episode, the direction has changed. It is do the best you can. We're going to see whatever you can pull out of this. If you're Crosby and you're Malkin, what can you pull out of this ragtag bunch of free agent dumpster dives? What can you do with that? And then we're also going to build for the future. I'm giving him a little bit of a higher grade simply because you got more than you paid for with Riley Smith. You got a second and a fifth. You got a second round pick for Kevin Hayes. And all of a sudden, you look at the Penguins the next couple of drafts. Let me pull it up here to make sure I get it entirely correct before Cap Friendly decides to go dark because, the Washington Capitals ended up doing that. You look at the draft picks they have. Full complement next year. They actually have 8 picks in next year's draft, including the St. Louis Blues second rounder. They have their full complement minus the 6th rounder, but they actually added a 3rd rounder. So they have 7 in 2026, and then they have 9 in 2027. Multiple 2nd round picks in 2027, multiple 3rd round picks in 2026, multiple 5th round picks next year. Being able to do that while materially not selling the farm, and I think he's going to continue to be able to do that, bring in more draft picks, bring in more guys like Ville Koivunen, who I'm very excited about, like a Vasily Ponomarev, who I'm very excited about. Cruz Lucius, time will tell. Based on that, I'll give him a B- because these are the moves of a rebuilding general manager, and he hasn't significantly hindered Sidney Crosby's ability. He hasn't helped him, but he hasn't hindered him going into next season, and he's also been able to add some pretty decent pieces for the future in those picks that he got in the Kevin Hayes trade and the picks that he was able to get in the Riley Smith trade. I was stunned that the Penguins got back more than they paid for Riley Smith. I understand that they retained $1.25 million, but hey, they're a rebuilding team. Who cares? Let's go to Matt's question here, and then I got to go catch up because you guys have been active in the comment section. Appreciate everybody for tuning into this one. If a Tarasenko signing doesn't happen, back to that one. Did the Penguins make a trade using one of their stockpiled draft picks for a top 6 winger? I'll echo what Kyle Dubas said in, again, losing track of my days. Either Friday when he talked to the media in Vegas or Monday when he talked to the media in Pittsburgh. It's probably going to look similar to what you saw with the Kevin Hayes trade. Somebody who's fallen out of favor with his current team, that has a pretty considerable cap hit that they want off the books, that if Kyle Dubas can make it happen and Kyle Dubas can make it fit, he'll take that and try to get a draft pick as a kind of sweetener in return. I don't know if they're going to use a lot. I don't think they're going to use a first round pick personally at all. I think first round picks right now are off the table, but that is just an outsider's perspective. I feel like Kyle Dubas wants to keep those in his back pocket. And unless the Penguins show him that they are above and beyond ready to go for a cup this year, which again, it's a long shot. Chance that it happens, on the slim chance that it happens, that's the only way I could see Kyle Dubas parting with one of those first rounders. I don't think he's willing to give up very much of anything as far as draft picks are concerned. So we'll have to wait and see. The ones that he was able to get, maybe he flips, maybe he flips one of those Rangers picks. Maybe he flips the third rounder in the Sharks third rounder for next year. But I think it's unlikely that he ends up doing something like that. Let me look through here because you guys have been, like I mentioned, really, really active here. Matthew Clark says, trade a mid-round pick for Patrick Laine. I can't narrow down what the Patrick Laine price is going to be, but I would have to imagine it's higher than a mid-round pick, even if he has an $8.7 million cap hit, especially because the Penguins right now, unless they're attaching some salary going back the other way, maybe it's an Eller, maybe it's a Nola Chari, they're not going to be able to fit it under the cap. They have $3 to $4 million left in salary cap space, even if the Columbus Blue Jackets retain half of that deal. That's still close to $5 million, $4.5 million. So there would have to be something going the other way. And I don't know if the price is going to be that low for the Pittsburgh Penguins. Pittsburgh Heather jumps in and says, is the risk for injury or age of Max Pacioretty too much for Dubas? Yes. I mean, he said he wanted to make the team younger and faster. Two of the players he added kind of spits in the face of that, and Kevin Hayes, who's 32, and Matt Grzelcyk, who's 30. But again, 30, not that old for somebody who hasn't had substantial injuries. I know Matt Grzelcyk dealt with a couple injuries last year, but he hasn't had substantial injuries throughout his NHL career. And 30 at this point in the NHL is not overtly old, right? That's still technically in the prime for a lot of these guys. The only reason Kevin Hayes came over is because it was for future considerations and they were able to attach a second round pick. I don't think they're going to go out and get a guy like Max Pacioretty just for the sake of bringing in Max Pacioretty. I don't think that fits the mold of what Kyle Dubas has shown to want to be doing in the next couple of years. Peter says, what do you think about Tanner Howe? Personally, I'm not the guy to ask about that. I have not dove into these prospects. It takes me a little bit longer to get into them. I will redirect you, if you have The Athletic, to go check out Jesse Marshall's piece, friend of the show. He does a great job of getting up quick, detailed, thorough, and immensely fun to listen to /read/watch ideas and thoughts on these prospects. He put one up today about Tanner Howe and the other second rounder for the Pittsburgh Penguins. So I would say you go over and do that. I still need to do a lot more research, Peter. So thank you very much for tuning in, but sorry, I can't give you a much more detailed answer into that. Z Smooth says, do you think David Quinn can rejuvenate Ryan Graves, Matt Grzelcyk, and Erik Karlsson? Man, when you spell it out that way and when you line them up in a row, starts to sound a little bit like a Herculean task for David Quinn, knowing the level that Graves played at last year, the level that Grzelcyk played at last year. So I think it's possible, especially because he already has a track record with Karlsson. And as I've stated on this show, I don't think Karlsson played poorly last year. He didn't, but he didn't reach the levels and the expectations that everybody had for him. I think he starts to get closer to those expectations under David Quinn. And I do think that odds are one of Graves or Grzelcyk returns to form. And honestly, in the spot that he's at right now, I'd say you probably start to see results more for Ryan Graves early in the season than you do for Matt Grzelcyk. Him alongside Jack St. Ivany sounds like a successful idea for Ryan Graves. Again, he was at a point and at a level last year where he was extremely bad. So is he going to be able to bounce back? I think he's in a pretty good situation if he's deployed in third line minutes alongside Jack St. Ivany. I think it's a pretty good spot for him. Pittsburgh Heather says, let me actually get a drink real quick, but she says, could a guy like Kubalik be an option for the Penguins? Only had 15 points last year, but had 46, 38, 32, 45 in the 4 years prior. Dominic Kubalik, I loved him when he played for the Chicago Blackhawks. I thought that he was a really interesting prospect. And I do think that he fits the mold. Without looking deeper into it, without pulling everything up and looking at his underlying numbers, it does seem like he fits the mold. But again, how many more opportunities are they getting, or how many more options do they have to bring in guys for the bottom six? I don't think he's a guy that goes with Crosby, but similar to Andreas Janssen, similar to Vinny Hinostroza last year, if you bring him in to be an AHL guy, to potentially, if those younger guys, Ponomarev, Koivunen, Poulin, aren't ready, to potentially jump frog them and take some NHL ice time, I don't hate it at all. I don't hate it in the least. I think he's an improvement on Anthony Beauvillier, but I think if they could have afforded him, he is a free agent, right? If they could have afforded him, then they would have went out there and tried to sign him before Anthony Beauvillier. Let me just check really quickly what his contract status is currently. He is a UFA. So yeah, if they could have afforded him, if he was at the top of their list, I feel like they would have gotten him before they got a guy like Anthony Beauvillier. Lenk says, is development camp open to the public? Yes, it is. The Penguins have all the information up on their website, but it is open to the public. Like I mentioned, it is July 6th through the 10th up in Cranberry. And I believe the 10th is whenever they're going to have a tournament there with all the players involved. So that one will be very fun to go to. And I think a lot of the players there, listen, you got all 6 of the draft picks this year. You got a majority of the draft picks last year. You got both first rounders of the 2 of the last 3 drafts. They didn't have one this year. They got Koivunen, who potentially could be at the NHL level this year. So he'll be in action over the weekend. It is open to the public. So, if I was up there, I'd be going, but I unfortunately don't live in the area. Mickey says, how do you think Blake Lizotte is going to do with us? I think he is going to become one of the fan favorites. I think he does, because when you look at what the Penguins fans like, how quickly did it take Brandon Tanev to endear himself to the fan base? 6 games, 7 games. And that was a player, that was a 4th line player specifically, who signed a horrendous contract, right? That was a 6-year deal for, I think, $2 million+ dollars. It was a horrendous contract. During the summer, everybody said, what are we doing? Why are we signing this guy? But it's sure fun to watch him. Blake Lizotte's on a good contract, and he's going to be a lot of fun to watch. So I'm excited. I think he's going to fit in well. I think he fits the mold for somebody that, even though he's young, and I know people say that Mike Sullivan doesn't like young guys, I think he fits the mold as somebody Mike Sullivan is going to really enjoy deploying on the 4th line. Think Jansen Harkins, but 10 times better. Maybe even 20 times better. And he signed, so you don't have to worry about him coming back to the Penguins unless it's on a trade, in which case I think everybody will riot. But no, I think Blake Lizotte's going to fit in very well with the Pittsburgh Penguins organization. Pittsburgh Heather says, who are the guys to start the season on the left side of the defense? Pettersson, Grzelcyk, Ludwig, Aho, Graves, and Ryan Shea are all options. Marcus Pettersson, number 1 guy. I think Matt Grzelcyk starts on the second pairing with Chris Letang, as I stated earlier. And I think you got Ryan Graves on the third pairing. I think it's a battle between Ludwig, Aho, and Shea to see who becomes the 7th defenseman. Aho is the leader in the clubhouse because, well, they just handed him a 2-year deal. So that makes him a little bit more realistic to be the leader in the clubhouse. Not to mention, John Ludwig is going to start the season. I don't know if he's going to start the season on IR, but he's currently rehabbing an injury that might force him into a slow start at the beginning of training camp, which is where he might be in the back there. Brandon says, from what I heard, Nick, according to Josh Yeo, he said that a leaked email has already said the signing of Tarasenko has happened. What is your assessment on that? Yes, the leaked email. I've seen that going around as well. I think it might have just been a typo, personally. I don't think it happened, because if it would have happened at this point, why would they not announce that? Right? They don't have to be cap compliant right now. They can go over the cap, look at the Washington Capitals. They would have announced it already. So I think it was maybe something that was typed up in a press release by the media relations team. Again, I'm on the outside looking in here. I'm going based off of hearsay. My assessment on that is the Penguins PR team knows that they're going after Vladimir Tarasenko. That much was reported as fact by Josh Yohe, that they have an offer on the table for Tarasenko. And I think they just prepped it and it accidentally made its way into an email. It's nothing that I'm looking too big on for the future. Tomorrow, great username, had me a little off balance there seeing that one. Tomorrow says, why does nobody talk about Klassen, Calvert, Beck, Jelsma? Would be huge if one of those guys hit. I mean, simply because they're guys that are just brought in, young, Atlee Calvert's interesting. Obviously, you know who his teammate was Braden Yeager last year. And he was, Calvert was a really big piece to that Moose Jaw Warriors team, simply because you haven't seen much about him, right? You haven't seen him on the ice at Cranberry very much. You're going to get the opportunity to see him this weekend. I'm sure some people still might not talk about them, but there are names to watch. You've headlined them. They're names that you want to keep an eye on. Atlee Calvert specifically is a guy that I'm going to keep an eye on. I hope it's better than the Felix Robert experiment, which for those who know and for those who don't, Felix Robert was the line mate of Sam Poulin back at the Sherbrooke Phoenix in the QMJHL. Penguins signed him to an AHL deal, and a couple of years later, he was out of the organization. Atlee Calvert, hopefully he comes and he sticks a little bit more. I'd like to see him play, whether that's the ECHL level or the AHL level. I would imagine he has a lot of talent. I'd like to see him start the year at the AHL level and see what he's able to do with some of these higher end prospects that the Penguins have, like guys like Koivunen that might start there, like guys like Sam Poulin that might start there. I think that would be really interesting. Jonathan's question here is, do you think Crosby used his influence on the organization to re-sign Malkin and Letang while going back 2 years ago? And would Crosby, because of that, commit himself to resigning in Pittsburgh? I'll talk about the last part of this first, Jonathan. Sidney Crosby signing another contract. I've said it multiple times. I'll say it again. It's a guarantee to me. It's not a matter of if he'll sign another contract with Pittsburgh. It's a matter of when. And one of those reasons, yeah, sure, I'm sure in his mind is, he committed to Malkin and Letang. He wanted them to be back with the Penguins organization. He's not going to walk out the door after all that happened. But at the same time, a much bigger reason is he's always stated outwardly and, to the media, to everything we've ever heard about Crosby is he wants to play his entire career with the Pittsburgh Penguins. He doesn't want to be a guy that at the end of his career bounces around. You saw how hard it was for Steven Stamkos this offseason. I'm sure that holds true for Sidney Crosby. The only difference is Penguins organization is going to acquiesce to anything Sidney Crosby asks for outside of being unrealistic, like $15 million a year. We saw on the opening day of free agency, David Pagnotta of the fourth period say that the talks and the scuttlebutt is that it's right now around a 3-year deal. I would assume that's where it is because that's where I thought it was the entire time. As far as whether or not he used his influence on the organization to re-sign Malkin and Letang, maybe he said something. He's a guy that, there's stories out there about did he or didn't he. I'm not going to sit here and, try to presume that I know what happened 2 years ago because I wasn't in the room. I don't text Sidney Crosby, so I'm not going to sit here and speculate on that. But, as far as his next contract, again, matter of if, or not a matter of if, a matter of when. Lucas says, would you take Trouba and his full contract if Drury added a first-round pick and then eventually buy him out? No. I'd like first-round picks. Don't get me wrong, but I'm steering clear of that entire Trouba situation. Now, again, I understand that it's a weird situation that he's in right now, saying that he's utilizing his no trade clause because his wife is in a residency in New York and he's trying to stay in New York. That's great. That is something that reminds everybody these are humans in hockey. These are not just names on a spreadsheet. These are not just stats on a spreadsheet. These are not just, ones and twos, X's and O's. These are humans. And, I like the fact that he did that for his wife. I think his wife certainly probably appreciates it. But if I'm the Penguins, I'm steering clear, especially if your idea is just to get him and then eventually buy him out. Kyle Dubas doesn't like buyouts. So from a realistic standpoint, it just doesn't fit the Penguins president of hockey operations. Let's do a couple more here because we are getting up close to the 1 hour mark. Let's go with Chris's first. Do you think high-end prospects such as Tristan Burrows, Braden Yeager, or others make the Penguins roster this upcoming season? Yeager, with the fact that the team is in a rebuild, looking at the moves they made so far this offseason, I think Braden Yeager is heading back to Moose Jaw. Again, there's a chance that he is good enough and ready enough to make the roster, but it just doesn't seem like they're willing to do that. He has 1 year left of eligibility with, the Moose Jaw Warriors. He cannot go to the American Hockey League. So I think he ends up, at this moment, that's my prediction, is that he ends up going back to the WHL and Moose Jaw. Tristan Burrows is going to start the year at the American Hockey League level. I don't think this is a year that I expect him to come up to the National Hockey League level. Certainly not in an aspect and in a capacity that we saw guys like Valtteri Puustinen last year, where he played 52 games. Maybe Bros makes a spot start, makes his NHL debut, starts 2 or 3 games if injuries befall the Pittsburgh Penguins, and he ends up being the guy that is hot at the American Hockey League, because the Penguins have shown that over the last couple of years. If you are the player that is playing hot, it doesn't matter where you stand in the prospect rankings. If you're the one that has scored 5 goals in 5 games, you're the one that's going to get called up for spot starts or a handful of games. So there's a chance Bros makes his NHL debut. I don't think he makes a significant impact if he does. I don't think he's a guy that comes up and plays 25, 30 games this next season. Looking at some of these other ones, any other questions that we have here? Z Smooth, already talked about that, but definitely Blake Lizotte, kind of the new Brandon Tanev, a little bit. Let's finish it off with this one here. Golden Doodles for life. One of my favorite names that we've gone through on here, because Golden Doodles for life has been in the comment section for months now, it seems like. Last question for today. Any regrets on not signing Jake Guentzel to that same contract? Would it have been worth it to keep Sid at his happiest? I don't think so, is what Golden Doodles for life says. No regrets on not signing Jake Guentzel to that contract, because Penguins are in a rebuild. And what has helped the most in this rebuild? The trade of Jake Guentzel. He is gone. I understand it. It was the right move at the time. Looking back on it, is 100% the right move, because you acquired, let me see if I can get this without looking back. You acquired Cruz Lucius. You acquired Ville Koivunen. You acquired Vasily Ponomarev. 2 of those 3 have a chance to make NHL playing time this year and potentially be everyday starters for a time. You also got a 2nd-round pick, and one of those 2nd-round picks will be in Pittsburgh this weekend. And I believe that was it. And then you offloaded Ty Smith, who was never going to get a chance here anyway. 100%. I don't have any regrets. I don't think the Penguins have any regrets either, because you brought in 3 guys that immediately go into, you could argue Cruz Lucius is in or out of the top 10. He's around 8, 9, or 10. You brought in 3 prospects that are now in your top 10, and significantly boosted the forward ranks as far as your prospect system. I don't have regrets. I don't think Kyle Dubas is going to have regrets. And I think at the end of the day, that was a smart and prudent move by Kyle Dubas and the Pittsburgh Penguins. But that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you guys so much. If you tuned in live, or if you're tuning in after the fact, thank you guys so much for tuning in to Tip of the Ice-Burgh Live. Remember, you can find us on YouTube at Tip of the Ice-Burgh, or anywhere you get your podcast from. We'll see you guys next time.